From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Joe Manchin scrambles to find 60 Senate votes to save his permitting reform as progressives and most Republicans look to be objecting. Is the bill good enough to deserve support? Plus, Al Gore and John Kerry try to stage a coup at the World Bank against President David Malpass so they can turn the bank into a guarantor of climate loans, public and private. Will they succeed? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot here with Kim Strassel and Joe Sternberg. Welcome to you both. First, let's listen to Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia, make his case on Fox News Sunday for passing his permitting reform.
Shan, this is not about me. My Republican friends, I've been working for 12 years with them, and I know their number one item that they've had and number one priority they've had is permitting reform. We can't build anything in America. It takes 5 to 10 years. The developed world takes 1 to 3 years. And why should we be so far behind the developed world to bringing products to market, to be able to have the infrastructure to move energy around? And we're asking people around the world to do things for us we won't do for ourselves. My Republican friends know exactly where we are. This is not about the previous legislation. This is something, a high priority that we have for our country. It's a time in history.
A time in history. So Joe Manchin had cut a deal with Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Senate leader, that in return for Manchin's vote to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, and that vote was the decisive one, which passed that big tax increase and enormous climate subsidies. In return for that vote, Schumer would get Manchin a vote on permitting reform by the end of September. Now they're trying to get that this week as part of the so-called continuing resolution bill to fund the government, which by the current funding expires on September 30th. So, Kim, you heard the senator. He also made his plea in our pages today to try to get this passed, no doubt trying to appeal to Republican senators who are on the fence. How persuasive do you think his case is?
Well, here's a problem for Joe Manchin. If you read that op-ed that he has with us, he'll lay out why he thinks this is honest regulatory reform. He points out that his bill would set deadlines for how long agencies have to work on these projects in terms of getting their permits out, that he would require simultaneous agency reviews and therefore reduce the time for permitting from what is currently 5 to 10 years down to under 3. He also says this bill deals with this other big elephant in the room, which is litigation, that it would cap how long plaintiffs have to bring lawsuits and require agencies to act quickly when permits are sent back to them by the court. But the problem, Paul, and as Republicans understand, is that when you actually read through his bill, he seemed to have sold his vote for this bigger Joe Biden priority on the cheap, because there's not a lot of substance here. Yeah, there are some deadlines set up, but there's absolutely nothing that compels agencies to comply with them. And if, as we know, agencies routinely blow through deadlines. So beyond the law saying you must do this, there's nothing that happens to an agency if they don't. And while there are some statutes of limitations for how long plaintiffs have to sue, it does nothing to reform the underlying statutes like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, which is what allows for these sprawling lawsuits in the first place that can be brought by basically anybody. So Republicans know this. They put forward their own alternative. I have no doubt Joe Manchin is honest when he says he believes this is an important moment in time. But the worry I think Republicans have is that you pass something that doesn't really do anything, and then all momentum for ever doing reform goes away.
Your point on lawsuits, Kim, is absolutely right. The provision says that a lawsuit against a project has to be filed within 150 days. Okay, great. The problem is that it doesn't limit the causes of action. So there's no change in the causes of action that can be filed under the NEPA Act, for example, which is the granddaddy of all environmental laws and is basically the uber obstruction legislation that is used by litigants and courts to block projects. And the bill does nothing about that. Now, I should tell you that Joe Manchin called me on the weekend. He was not happy with our editorial on Saturday on the permitting bill. which called it Joe Manchin's permitting bust. And he wanted to get his reply into the paper. And I said, fine, sure, we'll get that in. But, he does have a problem here. And his argument basically on NEPA and these other laws is you can't get it passed. There's no Democrats who are going to support me on that. So his argument is don't hold out for what cannot be achieved. Take what can be achieved now and hope that, in the future we can have a debate about the rest. But if you want to get anything done now, this is what you have to do, Joe. So what do you make of that political logic?
It's kind of an odd admission for him to be making, because really that argument is conceding that he got the sequencing on this all wrong when he agreed to vote for the green package billed as the Inflation Reduction Act in the first place before he got all of the permitting stuff in writing. Because the reality is that some of this more substantive permitting reform might have been achievable several months ago if he still had the leverage available of saying to some of his Democratic colleagues in the Senate, look, if you want to get this through, you have to give us a more substantial permitting reform that, by the way, might also have the political virtue of achieving some bipartisanship by peeling off some Republican votes who would at least support the bigger permitting reform. But we're having instead the kind of conversation that we're having now because he did not do that, because he decided to take Chuck Schumer and some of Manchin's Democratic colleagues at their word that they would do a permitting reform. And I think that a lot of the argument now, to my ear, has the flavor of trying to make a virtue out of necessity, which is he's kind of stuck with the minimalist permitting reform that he thinks can at least attract enough Democratic votes to get it through, especially given that some Democrat members of the Senate, such as Bernie Sanders, are going to be very opposed to anything that is at all more substantial than what's on the table right now. And so I think that Manchin is really scrambling to try to get anything that he can to at least say that he did succeed in getting some form of permitting reform done.
My reporting suggests, Kim, that Manchin needs probably about 15 Republican votes to get to 60. He's got most of the Democrats on board, but Bernie Sanders and Mr. Ed Markey of Massachusetts are formally declared, and he may not be able to get a couple of others, or they may be out. So the calculation is he needs about 15, and he's got a lot of Republicans. I mean, Mitt Romney's on board, Rob Portman's on board, Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia is on board with him. But I think he's still a couple of votes short, thus the scramble over the weekend on the TV shows and so on. We'll see if he can get it. And it comes down, I think, for calculation for Republicans, Kim, to something like this. Accept this now and then hope you can get more later, or block this now and hope the political pressure rises on Democrats to do something on permitting if the Republicans take Congress in November. Of course, the problem there is that Democrats can always use the filibuster to stop it. So you'd have to get significant Democratic buy-in, and that's where Manchin says you just can't get it. So as you look at this, do you think he's going to get the support, and should he, from the Republicans?
I'm not sure he is. And here's the other additional reason why is, I think you're right about that calculation for Republicans. I think what the problem is for many, many of them, and that this view is actually rising among the caucus, is that this bill isn't necessarily a marginal improvement. Yes, there are some things that are in there. You can certainly understand where Joe Manchin is coming from. But because he caved so much, it's potentially got some really bad provisions in it that could make things worse, for instance. And, just to give you a couple of examples, one thing is the president is allowed under Joe Manchin's bill to designate 25 energy projects of strategic national importance. But only 5 of those have to be fossil fuels or biofuels, meaning ethanol, which is not really kind of a fossil fuel project anyway. So that leaves the ability for the White House to use all the benefits of this bill primarily for renewable projects, not for fossil fuel projects, which was explicitly what Joe Manchin promised this would be about, easing the way for some of the bottlenecks because of leftist opposition. There's also a provision in here that gives the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, the ability to override states that have objections to certain power lines crossing over them. Now, the ability for states to veto this has been a problem in some ways, but this new rule in this statute would in fact specifically be about allowing FERC to impose over states' connections to what we call intermittent energy, which is essentially a renewable grid. So all of the states out there that have renewable mandates that are very costly for them, this would suddenly require other states that do not to essentially subsidize their ambitions. So there's some bad things in here, and that's what Republicans are looking at. And I think many of them are thinking, look, let's just hold out on this. At some point, the regulatory crunch is also going to hit Democrats and their renewable projects, and then maybe they'll be more willing to do a holistic reform.
Right. Meantime, we should mention that Joe Manchin in this bill would get his Mountain Valley Pipeline, which is 95% done and would move gas from West Virginia through to the southeast, natural gas, and is much needed, and we've editorialized in favor of it. But he would finally get that done with some of the provisions here. So he'd get that for him, very significant project at least completed.